Thanks very much. Good morning. So before I get going, I just want to say a couple of things. The first is that I'm an organisational psychologist, which means I believe in things like attitudes, feelings, motivation, performance, and I think there are links between those things. Of course there are. So my talk today is not saying there's no links between how people feel, their attitudes and performance. That's not what I'm saying, so be absolutely clear about that. The second thing I want to say is also as a psychologist, I'm interested in, amongst other things, in evidence. Evidence for the claims we make about interventions in the workplace, evidence we make about psychology, claims we make about all kinds of things in HR. And I'm part of something called the Centre for Evidence-Based Management. And what evidence-based management is about is trying to make decisions based on the best quality evidence or information, and that's from 4 sources. The first is from your own organisational data. The second source is your own experience as a practitioner. The third source is from the stakeholders, what do they think about what you're doing. But the fourth source of evidence, which is absolutely essential as well, is scientific evidence. I'm going to be talking most today about scientific evidence behind engagement. So that's what I'm trying to do today. So these quotes, but one from Mark Twain, one from Stephen Hawking, I think are very relevant because I think one of the things I find certainly around engagement and other areas as well in HR is that the issue is, it's not what we don't know that gets into trouble, it's what we think is true but isn't. Or if you prefer kind of Stephen Hawking, the greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. Ignorance is fine. If you say, I don't know, that's really good because it means you're going to try and find something out. The danger is when you think something's the case that turns out to not be the case. And what I'm going to argue is some of the key things we seem to be, all of us, apart from me perhaps, think are true about engagement, don't actually seem to be borne out by the evidence. Doesn't mean there won't be one day, doesn't mean there's no evidence, but in general, there's a lot of overclaiming around this. So just to give you some examples from other kind of areas. So for example, if I said to you, what's happened to job tenure in the past 10 years? Now, obviously, this is a kind of trick question, so you're probably going to give the opposite answer to the one you want to give. But given that, what do you think has happened to job tenure in the UK in the last 10 years? Put your hand up if the average job tenure you think has gone up. Put your hand up. Put your hand up if you think it's gone down. Okay, you all fell for it, fantastic. Put your hand up if you think it's the same, etc. So this is just an example, job tenure. This is from a CIPD report. A number of studies suggest the average amount of time people spend with an employer did not shift greatly from the mid-1970s to the mid-2000s. If you believe job tenure's gone down, you'll have all kinds of views about your workplace, who's leaving, retention, all that kind of stuff, which actually just, in terms of national statistics, it's just absolutely not borne out. In fact, job tenure's gone up slightly. So this is an example of belief, something you think is true, that's going to drive your behaviours and views and so on, which actually is quite harmful if you actually think that's true. This is from the US as well. In the US, similarly, this is the last 10 years, job tenure has actually slightly gone up. What about the other question in terms of job satisfaction in the UK? What do you think's happened? Now you're going to get the pattern, right? So now you're going to say whatever you thought is not wrong. What has happened to job satisfaction in the past 15 years? Put your hand up if you think job satisfaction has increased. Okay, now, yeah. Okay, what happened? So, do you think it's gone down? Put your hand up if it's gone down, because that's the rhetoric. It's got people unhappy. Who thinks it stayed the same? Okay, so this is job satisfaction. I don't know if you can actually kind of read that. This goes back to 1989. This is the percentage of people who in national representative surveys say they're completely or somewhat satisfied. Basically, that has not really changed in 30 years. It hasn't really shifted. There's small changes nationally, but again, it's a very kind of strong belief. Another one is VUCA. I'm absolutely sick of VUCA. I apologise if you're going to talk about VUCA later, but it just drives me nuts. Do you think the world of business is getting faster? Put your hand up if you think it's increasing and we're all kind of, yeah, okay, now you're really getting the idea. Okay, right. There's a great piece in The Economist published in December last year, and they asked a very interesting question. They said, basically, supposing it is the case that the world of business is getting ever faster, can we get some indicators that might show that? Can we actually start to measure things in the economy, things like CEO tenure, merger and acquisition, all this kind of thing that we think is increasing the pace of stuff? Of course, some things are getting faster, not that nothing is, but in general, can you see that picture? And you can't see that graph. Look at the Economist piece. This shows that lots of kind of things in the last 10 years, some have changed a bit, but in general, not a huge amount. Again, VUCA is a sort of huge assumption we make. And if you approach your work and what you do, assuming the world is ever fast, uncertain, volatile, then it changes the way you think about things and it changes what you do. But it could be dangerous. I'm not going to talk about that. Generational differences, again, there's actually very little evidence generally that there are very strong generational differences at work. Again, people really believe this very strongly. They can see it, or they think they can. Okay, these are some of the things about engagement we think are true, but we actually don't really know for sure. I'm going to go through each, well, I maybe won't go through all of them, but if you're interested in following these in more detail, there's two papers. One is on the Engage for Success website, the other's in HR Magazine, if you want to examine some of this in more detail, if you're kind of interested. So I'm going to go through some of the things we think we know for sure, but ain't true. The first thing, it seems to me in this field, in HR, people think engagement is a very well-defined and very, very clear thing. We all know what it is, right? Yeah, sure, right, okay. There is no agreed definition, and also the definitions are very consistent. Some definitions just talk about attitudes. Some definitions talk about behavior. Some definitions talk about attitudes to the organization. Some definitions talk about attitudes to work. Now, you might say, oh, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. Well, actually, it really practically does matter because it means we literally do not know what we're talking about. I don't know how many presentations there are here. There's possibly 50 presentations about engagement. Every single presentation could be about something different. It's all very jolly and nice, but it means that you can't aggregate any of this stuff together because everyone's talking about something else. This is a practically serious problem. Without precise language, you can't think clearly, you can't think critically, you can't do stuff that's important if you don't know what you're talking about. If engagement is so important, why is it in this area? People are very relaxed about this definition. They don't seem to care how you define it. I find it extraordinary if it's so important. So, what else do we think we know for sure? That there are valid and reliable measures of engagement. Okay. One issue is if your definitions are poor and confused, it is almost inevitable your measures are going to be confused and messy as well. And that appears to be, broadly speaking, the case. You may or may not know this, but Gallup Q12, for example, correlates extremely highly, 0.9. Correlation, the highest you can have is 1, the smallest you can have is 0. So that's pretty much measuring sort of the same thing. Correlates 0.9 with a 1960s measure of job satisfaction. Now, 1960s isn't bad. I just mean those measures have been around for a long time, and they're free to use. Okay? So, you know, if you're going to measure engagement, maybe you may just measure satisfaction because it appears to be very, very highly correlated. Also correlates 0.8, again, with measures of commitment. Why bother measuring something that correlates so highly with something else? Analysis of items shows that all measures of engagement that are available, commercial and academic, they're almost exactly the same as traditional attitude measures. Only one published study found engagement scores associated with, this is not cause and effect, but associated with performance over and above traditional attitudes. So if you measure things like satisfaction and commitment and you measure engagement, the question is, does engagement predict or correlate with performance once you've controlled for those things? Only one study has looked at that, and this study found it did a little bit. But that's it. There's not a whole lot of evidence. It's very different. There are no studies, published studies you can find, saying that measures of engagement have predictive validity, as in if you measure engagement now, it predicts something important in the future. There are no published studies. I have to say this analysis was about a year and a half ago, so the literature could have changed. If engagement is important, why don't we take measurement seriously? And as I said, do not get me started on the engaged, neutral, disengaged categorization. As far as I can see, it's just baloney. I've never seen an account that shows how you can make this distinction. What else do we think we know for sure? That engagement is different. We think it's different from previous concepts. These are all quotes from basically different kinds of commentators in the field. There is this fairly wide view that it isn't necessarily much new. As I said, first it correlates very highly with other things. The items in the scales correlate or look the same. A lot of people think it doesn't sort of add anything. We know a lot already about job attitudes, a lot in HR and organizational psychology. Satisfaction, commitment, those kinds of things. So what does it actually add? Is it anything new? There appears to be nothing new. There's two possibilities. Either engagement is not a new idea, and that's okay, all right. If it's not a new idea, then let's just stop talking about it and forget about it and just stick with the old ideas, okay? Because why not? It's just confusing. Or it is a new idea. It's a new and exciting and different idea. If it is, we need to show that. We need to find out. And at the moment, the evidence is not around that it is anything new or different. Why don't we take this more seriously? Why don't we actually try and find out if it's different? We seem to not do that. What else do we think we know for sure? We also think there's plenty of good evidence that shows the value of engagement. We think generally that's the case. For me, and I think for most of you, from a practical perspective, there's only two really important questions you need to answer about engagement. The first one is, If you increase engagement, if engagement increases, does performance increase? Does it? Okay, that's the first question. Does it do anything? The second very important practical question is, if you intervene to try and increase engagement, does that increase in engagement subsequently lead to an increase in performance? And to me, that's it. They're the only questions you would need to ask about engagement because they are the most important ones practically. If you can't answer those questions using a good quantity of good quality evidence, then these claims are just completely speculative. So what is the evidence for these claims? These claims are basically causal in nature. They're cause and effect. They're not about correlations. They're absolutely not about correlations. We want to know if one thing changes, does something else change later? That's what we need to know in this kind of area, for these questions. So what do you need to know about causality? You need to say that X affects Y. You need to say that covariation of those two things. If one goes up, the other goes up. If one goes down, the other goes down. And you need to rule out other plausible explanations. If you have those three conditions, you can start to speculate more clearly that there probably is a cause-effect link going on. How many published studies of engagement do you think can establish cause and effect? Published studies that you can look at the data and scrutinize it. I'm not talking about commercial data. I'm talking about data you and I can look at and say, is this right? How many studies do you think there are? Basically, at least a year and a half ago, there were none. There were no published studies. This is something called a hierarchy of evidence. It's used in medicine and other fields, and it doesn't apply to all evidence, but it does apply to evidence for those two questions I talked about. If you increase this, does this increase? And if you intervene to increase engagement, does it then increase performance? This is a kind of hierarchy. At the top is systematic reviews, which are reviews of all the evidence, and there's meta-analyses you've probably heard of. There's things like experiments, like randomized controlled trials, etc., etc., etc. And right at the bottom, in terms of quality of evidence, are expert opinion, anecdotes, and case studies. Now, I'm not saying, I like an anecdote. I like a case study. I'm interested in people's opinion. Nearly all this conference is that. Okay? But to answer those questions, it is considered to be the lowest quality evidence. It's really good for other stuff. It's really useful. It's really helpful. It might give you lots of insights. That's not the issue. But to answer those questions, if you do this, does this happen? The best available evidence is things like systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So what do we have in this field? We have no systematic reviews. We do have some meta-analyses. The meta-analyses are all cross-sectional. So those meta-analyses tell us nothing at all about those key questions because they cannot get at cause and effect. And it's entirely plausible, for example, that if people perform better, they report more engagement subsequently. If you think about your own lives, think about the time when you felt most satisfied at work or most engaged, probably, possibly, that was because you started to perform better. So even where you find a correlation, it's not clear if there's any cause effect, and if there is a cause effect, it might be the other way around anyway. So we just don't know. There's no randomized controlled trials, there's no longitudinal studies, there's about 10 cross-sectional studies which show some correlation, there's quite a lot of commercial peer-reviewed consultancy reports, and there is tons of expert opinion. There's no shortage of opinion. So within this field, what we have is a surplus of opinion and anecdote and a complete lack of actually really good evidence to say, does this fucking stuff matter? Right? What's what we don't have? But we have a huge amount of speculation, What else do we know for sure? People think that the general claims made about importance or role of engagement are accurate and reasonable. There's many, many claims that are going to be made at this conference I've already. That people think, that's a reasonable kind of claim to say engagement's really important. It links to performance. Is it? Do we have evidence for that? So there's a lot that seem to exaggerate for sure, and those claims are made by organisations such as Engage for Success, some academics, some practitioners, and some consultants made them. Not all of them do, but they kind of do. These kind of claims are just hype, and they cannot be trusted unless you can really show us the evidence that they're actually justified. I mean, it's interesting to think about it. It's good to ask the question, but you can't really make those claims. These are some examples from E4S. Blah, 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 productivity. We believe these two factors are related. I mean, seriously, if you think a nation's productivity is one of the most important drivers, is it an attitude? Really? Okay, maybe, but not generally found in psychology, certainly. Evidence demonstrates there's a correlation between engagement and productivity, employee disengagement, So these are some of the claims. Have any of you read a document called Nailing the Evidence on the E4S website? Yeah, well, take a look, and then if you want, take a look at the paper I produced on it. In this report, this is the bedrock of the whole movement in a way. Not one of the studies cited were in the section called engagement precedes performance. Not one of the studies were longitudinal. Okay, do you understand what that actually means? That's a claim saying this thing precedes, goes before, causes that thing. All the evidence they cited was cross-sectional. Everything was measured at one point in time. You cannot make that claim. You just can't. It's not accurate. It's just, you cannot do it. The 7 longitudinal studies that were included in this report did not measure employee engagement. They didn't even measure it. 5 of those studies, if you search the text, they don't even use the word employee engagement. So what I'm saying is the background, the basis of this section of the report that says engagement precedes performance, the evidence actually isn't there. It looks impressive unless you dig behind it. These are some other claims from CIPD. I won't go into all of them. Employees want this. Research has repeatedly demonstrated this link. A good summary of the performance link of employee engagement. I've just told you it's not a good summary. It summarizes evidence about attitudes and performance in terms of correlation. It does not summarize the causal evidence about engagement and performance. So again, just more broadly then, so does engagement cause performance? These are going to see some quotes. Relationships have not been rigorously conceptualized. Without this research, practitioners are especially vulnerable to positive-sounding repackaged workplace issues. And what's interesting, let's go back to job satisfaction. As most of you in the room know, this has been a contentious issue, the satisfaction performance link for 30, 40 years. And again, these are quotes from people that have done various research or some other views as well. But the search relationship between satisfaction and performance has been referred to as a holy grail. Study after study has failed to produce the expected result. There are some links, but they're not that strong. So the point is, if you're interested in improving performance, why would you start with a thing that's actually very weakly correlated with it? Why would you start there? It seems odd to me. The satisfaction performance related with is spurious. Results consistently showed low or no correlation between the two. Correlation only because performing well made employees feel more satisfied, as I mentioned already. So broadly speaking, within organizational psychology and HR, there are links between how people feel at work in terms of their attitudes and performance, but they're not particularly strong. There aren't many good quality studies. And I believe there are links, but possibly not in terms of engagement. Interestingly as well, a meta-analysis of the correlation between employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction, again, shows there is a link, but it's quite weak, suggesting that over 96% of the variation in employee satisfaction you get has nothing to do with how satisfied employees are. So again, it's not there's no link, it's just that it isn't maybe that important. So just to conclude, why isn't employee engagement more evidence-based? I think first is very much a lack of focus on diagnosing the problem. What is the problem engagement's going to fix? And will it fix it better than anything else that's cheaper or easier or whatever? There's also, I think, a reluctance or ability to analyze and diagnose apparent problems. This is Einstein's 60 minutes quote. He said, if I had 60 minutes to save the world, I'd spend 59 minutes analyzing the problem. I think in HR, that ratio is often reversed. It's 1 minute to analyze the problem, 59 minutes to implement an employee engagement program. It's reversed. You need to say what is the problem. I think engagement is a kind of non-solution in search of a kind of non-problem. I think it's not clear what the problem is it's trying to fix. There's also this very interesting broad plausibility. It seems to make sense that people are more engaged, perform better. And I agree. Of course it's very plausible. But it's also extremely vague. Any of you know anything about cycling or eating and drinking wine or cameras or diet? Know that these statements, they're not completely wrong, but they're not right either. Yeah, they're not wrong, but they're not right. A bit like engagement. It's not completely wrong, but it's not that right either. So where do we go from here? I think whenever you hear a claim about engagement, you're going to hear a lot today. What does the speaker or the writer mean about engagement? What is the claim suggesting? What specific evidence is being presented to support it? How much evidence is there? What's the quantity and quality? Can you scrutinize the evidence, or is it being kept secret from you? Analogy here is drug companies. Would you believe drug companies' own data on the effectiveness of their drugs? No, of course you wouldn't. You have to open this stuff to some kind of scrutiny. Otherwise, you just can't trust it. Just in general, not because people are evil or lying, because you just can't. You can't trust what academics say either, unless you can get hold of the data. The academics are just as prone to these biases as anyone else. How much do you trust it? And is there actually any good quality evidence for the absence of a link? In other words, is the evidence saying there is no link? Or is it more of the case we're saying there's an absence of evidence suggesting there is? And I think in the case of engagement, there's an absence of good quality evidence to suggest there is a strong or important link. I think that's what's going on. And if you want to know more about evidence-based management, or if you've got any comments or criticism, please email me. Thank you very much.